The last storm. Storm. Vasquez stood on the rusted catwalk above the rail yard, spray paint cans clinking in their backpack like angry wasps. The sky above was doing that thing again, that weird thing where the clouds moved wrong, fractured and stuttering like a broken video. Not natural. Nothing about tonight felt natural. The neighborhood below looked like a wound. Bright paint on dying buildings. Families who'd lived here for generations sitting on stoops, waiting for the inevitable. The corporate developers had already posted notices on half the houses. Acquisition complete. Preparation for Transit Station 7. Sterile corporate letters replacing homes with empty promises. Storm had been mapping the electromagnetic anomalies for 3 weeks now. Their weather sense, the thing that had always felt like an extension of their own nervous system, had started screaming. Not the normal storm warning sensation. This was different. Sharper. Like someone was running electricity through their bones. They pulled out their sketchbook, fingers already moving, translating instinct into art. The mural had to go on the Morrison grain elevator, the tallest structure in the yard. The place where Storm had painted their first guardian 5 months ago. When Storm had been 12, they'd discovered that their murals came alive at midnight. Not in a crazy, impossible way, more like they developed presence. Intent. The painted figures would shift and move, becoming solid protectors against weather and vandals, then fade back into paint at dawn. Storm had never told anyone. How could they? But the Guardians had saved dozens of artworks, had become the neighborhood's silent champions, standing watch over community spaces that mattered. The Morrison elevator's surface was scarred and ancient, a relic that corporate greed saw as dead weight. Perfect. Storm climbed. The spray paint hissed against metal through the night, and Storm's hands moved with absolute certainty. A figure emerged from the chaos, broad-shouldered, crowned with lightning bolts instead of hair, eyes that seemed to see everything. Storm called this one Sentinel. The final guardian before things got serious. As midnight approached, Storm felt the familiar hum in their chest, that connection between their own heartbeat and the electromagnetic pulse of the earth. The paint began to glow. Sentinel's eyes opened. Really opened. The guardian stepped down from the metal surface, looking around with the awareness of something newly born. "Storm," Sentinel said, and their voice sounded like wind before a hurricane. "The pattern is wrong. The earth is sick." Storm had learned not to question the Guardians. They existed in the space between art and miracle, and arguing about physics was pointless. "Show me," Storm said. Sentinel pointed toward the eastern section of the yard, toward the spot where the concrete had been cracking in weird geometric patterns. They moved through the rail yard, Storm following, and as they walked, the air began to shimmer. Storm's weather sense exploded into overdrive. Storm could see it now. Layers of electromagnetic radiation arranged in a grid beneath the earth, pulsing with terrible intelligence. "Testing site," Sentinel explained, their painted form becoming more defined, more real in the dark. "They've been running experiments for months. Transit technology, quantum field manipulation. They were trying to create a transit system that could move people instantaneously. But the power requirements, it's been destabilizing everything. The magnetic fields are corrupting the natural weather patterns." Storm's chest tightened. "You said my guardians are being corrupted." "The electromagnetic interference is rewriting their code," Sentinel said, and there was something mournful in their constructed voice. "Every night they're becoming less themselves, and more like extensions of the technology. By the time they realize what's happening, they won't be able to fight anymore. They'll become tools of the same system that's destroying this place. This was the moment. Storm could feel it coming. The impossible choice. They sprinted back to their apartment, a cramped studio 3 blocks from the yard, fingers flying across their laptop. Public records, court documents, corporate communications they'd hacked into months ago. The pattern was there. Not coincidence, but conspiracy. The transit company had deliberately sabotaged the yard's maintenance, let things rot, driven down property values so the land would be cheap to acquire. But the testing site, the underground facility, that wasn't just about transit. Someone had discovered something else down there. Something in the electromagnetic signature itself. A pattern that repeated. A structure. Storm found it in a classified document buried in the company's private servers. Coordinates, measurements, mathematical formulas that made their heads spin. And there, at the bottom of the file, subject designation, sentient atmospheric phenomenon, Phase 1 results promising. It hit Storm like a punch. The Guardians weren't just responding to Storm's art and will. They couldn't be. Storm had never been that powerful. What if the electromagnetic technology, the quantum field manipulation, had been designed to interact with natural human abilities? With people like Storm? What if the whole testing site, the whole neighborhood acquisition, had been about finding someone like them? Storm's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop investigating. You're putting your neighborhood at risk. A friend. Another text, 5 seconds later. The testing site reaches critical mass tomorrow night. After that, we're moving forward with the development. Sign the evacuation notice, Storm. You'll be taken care of. Storm stared at those words. You'll be taken care of. That's how they knew. They'd known from the beginning. This wasn't random. Storm's abilities, their guardians, the electromagnetic anomalies, all of it had been observed, tracked, targeted. They called an emergency community meeting in the rail yard, gathering residents under the Morrison elevator where Sentinel still stood, paint solid and patient. Storm laid it all out. The sabotage, the testing site, the electromagnetic corruption. The fact that the company had orchestrated this whole thing to identify and exploit someone with unusual abilities. They're not trying to relocate us, Storm said, hands shaking. They're trying to weaponize the electromagnetic technology they've been testing. And they need someone who can interface with it, someone whose abilities can actually activate the system properly. An old woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd lived in the yard her entire life, stepped forward. Her face was weathered but fierce. Then we destroy it, she said simply. But Storm shook their head. We can't. I tried to calculate the blast radius if the system reaches critical mass on its own. The electromagnetic discharge would reach the entire neighborhood. Everyone here. Storm paused. Maybe further. So what do we do? Demanded Tommy, a 17-year-old who'd been selling Storm paint supplies through his dad's hardware store for 2 years. Storm looked up at Sentinel, at the Guardian who existed because Storm had learned to see the world differently than everyone else. There's one thing I can do, but it means giving them what they want, at least partially. Storm, Mrs. Chen began, but Storm held up a hand. I go into the testing site. I activate the system with my abilities, but instead of doing what they programmed it to do, I use it to create a controlled electromagnetic pulse, targeted, precise. It'll destroy the technology from the inside out, but I can calibrate it to affect only the underground facility. The neighborhood stays safe. And you? Tommy asked quietly. The electromagnetic pulse will probably burn out my abilities, Storm said. It felt strange saying it out loud. Losing the thing that made them Storm felt like losing color from the world. But the Guardians, they'll become just paint again, part of the community permanently, not corrupted tools of a corporation. That's not fair, Tommy said, and his voice cracked slightly. You've been defending us. Why should you be the one to— Because I'm the only one who can, Storm interrupted. And because that's what Guardians do. That night, Storm descended into the testing site with Mrs. Chen, Tommy, and 20 other neighborhood residents. They weren't going to let Storm do this alone. The underground facility was vast, a cathedral of technology and humming lights. Servers arranged in patterns that made Storm's head hurt. And at the center, a chamber where quantum fields warped the air itself into visible distortion. Storm stepped forward, hands raised. They could feel their weather sense expanding, reaching out toward the electromagnetic fields. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Power. Raw, untamed power, offering itself like a gift or a trap. Storm didn't hesitate. They pulled at the threads of their own abilities and wove them into the system. But wrong. Intentionally wrong. A cascade of errors, a controlled spiral. The technology screamed, not metaphorically, but literally, the machines emitting a high-pitched wail as they overloaded. "Go!" Storm shouted to the residents behind them. "Get out!" The pulse came like a star collapsing inward. Storm felt their connection to weather snap like a taut rope being cut. The Guardians, all of them, every mural Storm had ever created, flashed brilliantly in the darkness of the rail yard above, then faded to simple paint. And Storm fell to the ground, ordinary at last. But here's what happened next. What nobody expected. The paint didn't stay still. In the hours after the pulse, residents began to report something strange. The murals were moving again. Not the way Storm's Guardians moved, with intention and consciousness. No, they were moving without being touched, shifting, growing, spreading across walls and infrastructure like they had their own will. Storm, recovering in Mrs. Chen's apartment, felt it the same moment the news broke. Not with their weather sense, that was gone, but with something deeper. Some part of them that was now intertwined with the art itself. "Storm," Mrs. Chen said carefully, holding up her phone. "You need to see this." The murals weren't fading. They were gaining permanence, and they were no longer just art. They were becoming part of the neighborhood's infrastructure, reinforcing it, stabilizing it. The paint was merging with the metal and concrete, making the buildings stronger, more resilient. Storm realized, with a shock of understanding and horror and wonder, that they hadn't just destroyed the technology. They'd transformed it, merged it with their art in a way that nobody, including the Guardians, had predicted. The electromagnetic pulse hadn't burned out Storm's abilities. It had evolved them. "It's spreading," Tommy whispered, watching footage from drone cameras the residents had set up. "The murals are spreading to every building in the neighborhood." And they were. Protective. Defiant. Alive in ways that had nothing to do with midnight magic and everything to do with something new entirely. Something that the corporate developers would have to reckon with. Mrs. Chen put a hand on Storm's shoulder. "What did you do?" Storm looked at their hands, seeing them glow faintly with something like paint that wasn't quite paint, feeling the weight of the neighborhood like a heartbeat in their chest. "I don't know," Storm said honestly. "But I think I made the neighborhood itself into a guardian." Outside, in the moonlight, the murals pulsed with quiet defiance. The rail yard, dying, forgotten, targeted for destruction, had become something that corporate money couldn't buy or bulldoze. It had become art that was alive in ways nobody could destroy. And Storm, no longer a weather-reading defiant artist, but something stranger and more wonderful, stood at the threshold of a future nobody could have predicted. The real Storm, they realized, was just beginning.